Hello to everybody. My name is Claudia Juncker. I'm leading the work on quality and peer reviews in Eurostat, and today I will give a lecture on the statistics quality frameworks in the European statistical system and in the European system of central banks. The first elements I would like to introduce are about the quality framework for the European statistical system, and here we have two strands, I would call them. One is a legal framework, because quality is even mentioned in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union with 7 principles in Article 338, so in the very foundation of the European Union. But of course it is also mentioned in our regulation number 223 from 2009, which was then slightly adjusted in 2015. And this is what we call the statistical law, or the law on European statistics. And here we have 6 quality principles mentioned, like professional independence, impartiality and objectivity, reliability, statistical confidentiality, and cost effectiveness. We have a mentioning of the European Statistics Code of Practice in our law. And we have an article on quality reporting and on the output quality criteria. At the third level, we also have what we call domain-specific sector legislation. This is, for example, about business statistics, social statistics, national accounts. And here in the regulations, we also have some specific quality provisions. Then when we come to the quality framework itself, we have to say that it is not legally binding. It is a self-commitment. Also, some of the principles of the code are mentioned in the statistical law. These elements, of course, are legally binding, but the majority of the principles is part of the European Statistics Code of Practice, which is the cornerstone of our quality framework. And as I said, these constitute a self-commitment by the national statistical institutes of the European statistical system. You have the link to the code on the slide. So this is the cornerstone. Then we have what we call the ESS Quality Assurance Framework. Again, the link is on the slide. You can have a look at it, and I will also explain a few more things about them. And then as part of the quality framework, we also have what we call general quality management principles. These are, for example, continuous interaction with users, commitment of the leadership, staff satisfaction, continuous improvement culture, integration and harmonization. And on the fourth level, we have again sectoral or domain-specific legislation. Now you can see a kind of pyramid of the various levels of our quality framework. So you see on level 1 and level 2, the principles and indicators of the European Statistics Code of Practice. This is the little brochure that you see on the slide in the left upper corner. So they constitute level 1 and level 2. And then we have the ESS Quality Assurance Framework. You see the brochure in the right upper corner of the slide. And this Quality Assurance Framework on level 3 provides more explanation, more details, good practices, tools on how to implement the indicators and the principles on level 2 and level 1. And the pyramid also displays the statistical sectors, the specific quality assurance methods in each of the domains, what we call level 4. So this is an illustration of what I said before. Now let's come in more details to the European Statistics Code of Practice with 2 levels. On level 1, we have 16 principles. On level 2, we have 84 indicators. And just before starting principles and indicators, we also have what we call the quality declaration of the heads, director generals of the national statistical institutes of the European statistical system. The Code of Practice with its 16 principles is divided into 3 areas. One is called institutional environment, the second one statistical processes, and the third one statistical output. And here I will give you some explanations about each of the principles, and then I will go into more detail into in the two of our most important principles. So the first one on professional independence, I will give some explanations afterwards. The second principle is called coordination and cooperation. It's a new one since the revision of the code in 2017. It deals with the coordination of the national statistical system, and that the NSIs have this coordinating role. So they have to coordinate other national authorities producing European statistics. For example, a statistics department in the Ministry of Agriculture, in the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, and so on. And the principle also talks about cooperation with other stakeholders, for example, with the academic and the research community. Then we have a principle called mandate for data collection, and that talks about the legal basis for us to collect data from households, individuals, enterprises, and others. And it also mentions the right of a National Statistical Institute to access other data sources, mainly administrative data sources that are kept, again, by ministries or agencies. Another principle talks about the adequacy of resources. This is mainly about the fact that we need human resources, financial resources, and also IT resources to do our work, to collect data and publish them. But it also talks about the planning and the monitoring and the reporting on the use of the resources. Principle number 4 is commitment to quality. So here we state that we indeed are committed to produce quality data. The principle or the indicators talk a bit about a quality policy, that there should be regular reviews of quality, and there should be also an organizational structure in an organization to deal with quality. Principle number 5 is about statistical confidentiality. This is that about individual data that go into the office are never disclosed. A statistical office can only disclose aggregated data. And for that we need a legal basis, we need the technical conditions and also organizational requirements to be sure that we can keep the confidentiality. Principle number 6 is called impartiality and objectivity, and I will combine it together with the principle on professional independence and give you some more details later. The second area, as I said, is about statistical processes. Here we talk about sound methodology, so methodology how to produce certain data, the registers that we need to draw from, classifications, that there should be vocational training, permanent vocational training for the staff of an office, and so on. In the principle on appropriate statistical procedures, we talk about the monitoring of statistical processes and also agreement with other data holders, the so-called administrative data holders, again, which are mainly ministries and agencies, so public organizations. Then there's a principle called non-excessive burden on respondents, and that talks about the fact that we should only collect the data that is really necessary for us to produce the statistics and not data that we just like to have. And that we also measure the response burden on the households, mainly on the enterprises, but also on households, on individuals. And the last principle in this area is called cost effectiveness, and this is mainly about the efficient use of the resources. The third area is about statistical output. And here we first of all talk about the principle of relevance. So saying that we produce data that are relevant for users, not data that we think we like or they look nice. No. We should produce data that are wanted and needed by our users. And the last 4 principles on accuracy and reliability, timeliness and punctuality, coherence and comparability, accessibility and clarity are what we call the quality dimensions. So they describe what kind of quality dimensions our data should follow. Let me now come to principle 1, professional independence, and I'm highlighting this principle because it's of particular importance for every national statistical institute, not only in Europe, but in the whole world. Because if we are not seen as professionally independent, then our data will not be used, will not be believed, will not be trusted. And in the code, we have 8 indicators to specify what does it mean, professional independence. And I would like to highlight here that this is really about professional independence, not organizational independence. Of course, every national statistical institute, like any other agency, depends organizationally on someone. So can be a ministry, Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Finance, can be the Parliament, can be the Prime Minister directly. The setups are different, but organizationally, we will always depend on somebody. But professionally, we should be independent. We should not follow instructions. And that's what this principle says. So first of all, it says the principle of professional independence should be specified in our statistical law so that we have a legal basis for it. Then it says that the heads of the statistical authorities, institutes or agencies, whatever is the name, have a sufficiently high hierarchical standing, so they are also accepted by other ministers, for example. The heads of the statistical authorities also have responsibility for ensuring the development, production and dissemination of European statistics in an independent manner. The next indicator in this principle really talks about a fundamental issue in professional independence, and it says that the heads of statistical authorities have sole responsibility for deciding on statistical methods, standards and procedures. And here the word sole is very important because, of course, in our work we consult the academia, we consult users on what kind of data they need. The academic, we can also consult on some procedures, on some methodology issues, but at the end of the day, it is the head of the statistical authority that decides on the methodology. The head decides, of course, on the basis of input from his or her colleagues, what goes into the consumer basket that will at the end measure the inflation rate, or what are the definitions for what is an employed person, what is an unemployed person. As I said, we can have a lot of consultations, but the final decision on how we count these data is with the head of the statistical authorities. Another element is that, and expressed in indicators, is that there are statistical work programs. So the users know at the beginning of the year, what are we going to provide in terms of data over the year? And there are reports after that year where we report ourselves what we did during the year. So the users can compare what we promised to do and what we really did at the end of the year. And this gives a kind of independence that users can see, or they promised us to produce inflation rates every month, but at the end they didn't. So probably there was something with independence. Then we have an indicator in this principle that statistical releases are clearly distinguished. So it should be clear this is a release, a press release, a news release coming from a statistical office, and therefore is providing a certain quality of the data that are contained in this release. And we also have an indicator that statistical authorities comment publicly on statistical issues. For example, if certain data published by us are misused by the media. The last indicator is a very, very important one. It was added in one of our revisions of the code, and in this case in the last one in 2017, and it talks about the procedures for the recruitment and appointment of the heads of statistical authorities, and that they should be transparent and based on professional criteria only. So there should be a procedure when a head of a statistical authority has to be appointed, a vacancy procedure, published, transparent recruitment procedure, and the criteria for somebody who would like to apply and then will be appointed as the head of a statistical authority should be professional criteria. So not belonging to a party or to be a friend of someone, but to have professional criteria. This is the principle 1. Now, there are also other principles in which elements of professional independence are mentioned. Also, they belong maybe to a different heading. One is that it is the head of statistical authorities who decides on the content and timing of statistical releases. That belongs to still principle 1, but I mention it here specifically because the content and also timing of statistical releases can be very sensitive. For example, you have elections on Sunday. Everybody knows the inflation rate is going up, unemployment rate is going up, GDP is going down. And somebody who would like to win the election may want to tell the statistical office, but you don't publish your data today on Friday before the election, you publish them after the election. No. An element of professional independence is that we fix the dates of the release, for example, of the GDP figures, and we do it at that date and also at a predefined timing, like 11 o'clock in the case of Eurostat. If this kind of principle is kept, that it's the head of the statistical authorities deciding on the content and timing, you can be relatively sure that the office has or enjoys a certain degree of independence. The other element linked to this kind of releases, but covered in a different principle, in principle 6, is that the statistical release dates and times are pre-announced. So all the users will know that the inflation rate is published on the 11th of the month, following the reporting months at 11 o'clock. And everybody has equal access to this statistical release at the same time. Nobody gets pre-release of release on the inflation rate, for example, or unemployment rate, like 2-3 days before, so that they can influence the publication of the results. This is a very important element that is also publicly visible, that you announce a release date and you keep it. If you can't keep it, of course, which can happen, then you also have to announce the postponement of the date and the time. Now, I have said that all the users should have equal access, but of course there can also be some exceptions. For example, in the case of Eurostat, our cabinet and our commissioner, which is kind of our minister, receives this information 1 or 2 hours before the release to be prepared for questions from the press. This is also the case in some member states, and this is not 100% in line with the indicator and the principle, but it may be necessary. If this kind of pre-access is given, we have to be transparent about it. We have to have an impartiality protocol published on our website, which states very clearly and visible to everybody who gets pre-access to certain data and when. And this is what then the indicator 6.8, so in principle 6, says: any privileged pre-release access to outside users is limited, justified, controlled, and publicized. Now, this was about the code of practice. As I said, there is a level 3 covered in the quality assurance framework of the European statistical system. And on this slide, you have one example, just to illustrate what this quality assurance framework contains. So I have chosen principle 1, we have talked about it, professional independence, the indicator 1.6, on the statistical releases, which are clearly distinguished and issued separately from political or policy statements. And then you can see on the slide that in the quality assurance framework, we have 4 methods on how to implement the indicator, even how to measure the indicator. And there we have, for example, the description of statistical outputs, that an office has internal guidelines for describing statistical outputs to users, including formulations on how to be non-political in statements. So that's a good practice. If you have some guidelines to your staff on how to describe data in a non-political way. The second good practice or method is that there is training to colleagues in the office how to communicate about statistics. A third one is about the identification of releases, so that you have a certain brand or label that users know immediately when they see this label, okay, this is a statistical release from the National Statistical Institute and we can trust the data that are mentioned there. And in order to do that, you have a fourth practice in the QAF, and this is a definition of the brand, that each statistical office has a kind of logo or label, so it's easily recognizable by its users. With that, I have finalized the presentation of the quality framework for the European statistical system. Now we come to the quality framework for the European system of central banks statistics. And here you see what they call a public commitment on European statistics. The public commitment is on the website of the central bank. They base their public commitment on the United Nations Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics and also on the IMF Data Quality Assessment Framework. And in the principles you can see below this commitment, you see a lot of similarities between the ESS Code of Practice and the ESCB quality framework. So I will go into some more details. This public commitment, as I said, is on the website of the ECB. You can find it there, and you also have a link. In the pretext to the principles, they highlight that they work like the European statistical system based on a legal mandate to collect the data. They comply with European and international agreed standards, as I said, the United Nations Fundamental Principles and the IMF standards, that the statistical function is independent, that of course they collaborate with us, the European statistical system, and the principles are mutually consistent with our code of practice, that they effectively use the resources, minimize the reporting burden, and also protect the confidentiality of the data. So that is in the pretext. And then you can see on the slide what are the quality principles and only the principles in their public commitment. The principles are very much the same. They are missing out on the principle on coordination and cooperation, but this is a relatively new principle in our code. That's why maybe it is not yet mentioned by the central bank public commitment. And then the principle, as I said, are the same, but there are slight differences in the number of indicators. For example, in Principle 1, they have a few less indicators, but in Principle 6, they have one more indicator compared to our code. But otherwise, you see a lot of consistency and coherence in our quality frameworks. As a last element, I would like to mention how we monitor our quality framework, because it's always nice to have a framework, but there's also a need to know how we actually implement it. So we don't have just statements that we implemented, but we also control it. And for us, this is what we call peer reviews in the European statistical system. And they are used to assess the compliance with the European Statistics Code of Practice, so the cornerstone of our quality framework. It's not the first time that we do that. Every time we have either developed the code or revised the code, we have a round of peer reviews. So the very first version of the code was developed in 2005, meaning that it was followed by peer reviews in the period 2006 to 2008. Based on the outcome of these peer reviews, we again revised the code in 2011 and then embarked on the second round of peer reviews from 2013 to 2015. I have already said that we revised the code in 2017, and this is why we are now in the starting phase of the peer reviews, the third round of peer reviews, which will last from 2021, this year, to 2023. And the peer reviews assess the compliance with the code, but they also help us to identify improvements, maybe even looking beyond the code, what we could do better. Many member states also see it as a good way to identify good practices that they could share among each other. The peer reviews that we implement are a very common work of the European statistical system. We have developed a methodology together with various expert groups and finally decided by the highest committee, the ESS committee. We will use in this round of peer review a combination of audit-like and peer review approach, meaning, for example, the audit approach says we should have evidence for any kind of statements we do. So if an office says, I have a human resource policy, I have a training policy, I have a dissemination policy, they have to provide the evidence, the policy documents. Audit-like approach also means that at the end, when experts have published, or not published yet, but provided their report, an office has the right for a diverging view. So they can say with one of the recommendations of the experts, we don't agree because we have already tried it. Our legal framework doesn't allow us to do this kind of thing. Of course, it has to be well justified, but they have the possibility. And this diverging view is published together with the report from the experts. On the other side, on the peer review approach, we use experts from inside the ESS. We develop this methodology together. We will benefit from the exchange of good practices. So this is helping each other, I would say. In the peer reviews themselves, we will use both experts from inside the European statistical system, so from the NSIs, but also external to the ESS experts, freelancers, statistical consultants, retired experts, and so on. And the peer review is done in the following way. We have a self-assessment questionnaire that each office has to fill in, and also some of the other producers of European statistics in each country. And then the self-assessments are followed by visits to the country of the experts for roughly a week. Afterwards, the experts will produce a report with their recommendations. And based on this report and the accepted recommendations, each statistical institute will develop an action plan to implement improvements. And these improvement actions are then monitored and followed up on an annual basis by Eurostat. And of course, reported also to the ESS. If you want to know more about peer reviews, you have a link on the slide. And as a final word, the peer reviews are mainly a monitoring, a measurement of the institutional elements of the code. But we have also other elements that go a bit more into the statistical domains and quality of data. And these are the quality reports, these are quality reviews, and this is also error reporting. When we publish, we don't publish it, but internally in Eurostat we monitor the errors that are reported to us by the users and see how to avoid such kind of errors in the future. But these details will be then provided in the next presentation by my colleague on the quality reporting. Thank you.